Um, I am okay. All right, we're in Daniel chapter 2 still. After last week's lesson, last week's lesson kind of this week's lesson, excuse me, kind of concludes a really strange sequence of events that in the lives of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar that started last week. And as you recall from last week's lesson, Nebuchadnezzar had a really strange dream. So he called in his magicians and his enchanters and sorcerers and the Chaldeans. And he said, not only do I want you to interpret the dream, but you have to tell me the dream. So it seems like he knew the dream and he was testing his wise men to tell him. There are some reputable commentators. I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago that at least hold out the possibility that Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten his dream. A couple of points that support that. There's an old Babylonian omen that has this quote: "If a man cannot remember the dream he saw, his God is mad at him." So there was, certainly as we see through the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar probably got the feeling that God was mad at him. The Amplified Bible translates verse 5 and 8, the thing is gone from me. So it's probably the strongest argument in favor of the idea that Nebuchadnezzar forgot the dream. But I keep coming back to the question, if Nebuchadnezzar, I'm having a hard time with that name tonight, if Nebuchadnezzar forgot the dream, how would he know? How would he even know if his wise men came up with the right or wrong answer when they told him what it was? So I'm leaning more toward the notion that Nebuchadnezzar knew the dream and he was testing the wise men. If he could trust them to, but whether he knew the dream or not, if he the real drama lies in the fact that he threatened his wise men to have them torn limb from limb, if they couldn't interpret the dream. So enter our young hero Daniel, one of the king's wise men. He was under the same sentence of death that the rest of the magicians and enchanters and sorcerers and Chaldeans were, apparently. So he got an appointment with the king, and he gathered his three friends and held an old-fashioned prayer meeting. And God granted their request to show Daniel the dream and its interpretation. So throughout, I love Daniel because throughout this book we see God work in some really incredible ways to glorify Himself through Daniel and his friends. And as tempting as it is to see them as sort of spiritual superheroes, I think we always have to keep at the forefront of these stories that God is the real hero. And we know this because Daniel's quick to acknowledge this in his prayer, where he says, to you, O God, my Father, I give thanks. O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we ask of you, and you have made known to us the king's matter. So he's attributing his wisdom to God's giving it to him. And so we know Daniel certainly believes that God was the hero of this story. So we should too. So our reading this week kind of opens up in verse 31 of chapter 2. And we see Daniel says, you saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So it was an incredibly scary image, frightening or terrible. It's sometimes translated awesome. Today, the Hebrew word translates to fear or to cause to be afraid or to make afraid, just like the ESV says, frightening. So this wasn't a dream. This was a nightmare. It left Nebuchadnezzar shaking in his boots, so to speak. In this dream, we see God speaking to Nebuchadnezzar in a way that he'll understand. Nebuchadnezzar certainly doesn't have the relationship with God that Daniel does. So he didn't pray to God. He didn't get revelation from God through answered prayer. God spoke to him by using an image. Image, it was familiar to Nebuchadnezzar because in Babylonian pagan religion and idolatry, they worshipped images. So the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream um, wasn't necessarily an image to be worshipped, but because he did worship images, God got his attention this way. So this type of vision was probably the only language that Nebuchadnezzar would really understand when it came from God. Um, we see there this vision, this statue, this idol or image was made up of four different elements. Because the fifth element is really a repeat of the fourth mixed with clay. So we see that the head of gold, the arms of silver, the body of the brass, legs of iron, and feet of iron and clay. Does anybody remember from their junior high science class what the term specific gravity means? And I know you can't answer me on this call, but specific gravity is the ratio of the density of a substance to the density of a standard, usually water for a liquid or solid and air for a gas. Gold, for instance, is almost 20 times more dense than water. In other words, it weighs about 20 times more than the same amount of water. It's interesting that these elements, in order that they appear here, are in decreasing levels of specific gravity. It's they're also laid out in order of precious, most precious to least precious. But as they degenerate in value, they increase in strength. Because we see silver is stronger than gold, and bronze is stronger than silver, until we get to the last one, that's a mixture of iron and clay. So this image that's before Nebuchadnezzar just stands there. It doesn't say anything. The head was gold, arms, the breast and arms were silver, belly and thighs were brass, legs were iron, and feet were iron and clay mixed together. So the image consists of a really strange assortment of metals. And if it's possible, next the dream gets even stranger. And Daniel says, as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So we know that this statue wasn't permanent. We see that it's struck on the feet by a rock cut by no human hands, and it destroyed the whole statue. That it became like chaff. It was blown away. Chaff, as you know, is that light, inedible part of the grain that blew away when they were winnowing it or tossing it up in the air. And so it became like chaff, and then the stone kind of takes center stage here. The stone becomes a great mountain. It said the image was gone and destroyed, and in its place there's this mysterious mountain. Notice here what Daniel says in his interpretation or in his telling of the dream, that the stone didn't just fill part of the earth; it filled the whole earth. The events that in Nebuchadnezzar's dream that we're hearing about are going to affect the whole earth. So this event apparently symbolized a time when the last kingdom would be shattered by divine agency, because we know it's not by human hands. As we're going to see later, we'll talk a little bit about the fact that the stone represents Jesus, and that stone's going to usher in a worldwide kingdom of God and the reign of Christ. So the upshot of all this is Daniel bought himself and his friends instant credibility with the king. Nebuchadnezzar had to be thinking, if they can tell me the dream, their interpretation certainly has to be trusted. that's relative to the two things. To me, it seems like telling him the dream is probably the harder in this case. So Daniel goes on to tell us now this was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. I think it's interesting here that we notice the word we here. We will tell the king its interpretation. Apparently, Daniel's three friends were there with him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were there, maybe for moral support, or maybe at the king's command, since all their lives depended on Daniel being able to tell this dream and its interpretation. Nevertheless, Daniel told the king what the dream was, and now they're going to interpret the dream for him. We will tell the king its interpretation. He goes on to say, "You, O king, the king of kings, to whom God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of heaven, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold." Excuse me. God gave Nebuchadnezzar the power. He wanted to be sure that Nebuchadnezzar understood that all that he has isn't by his own achievement; it's a gift of God. This kind of confirms a statement that Daniel made back in 2:21 when he says he removes kings and sets up kings. God, this ought to be a comfort to us, those of us on this call, and to all believers. Pardon me. God is still sovereign, and he can do as he wills among men, even pagans and unbelievers. Just because a man or a woman is an unbeliever or even antagonistic toward God doesn't mean that God can't use them to fulfill his purposes. So we need to always, as Christ followers, to keep that in mind, that people in positions of authority are really God's instruments. God can use them as he sees fit. So Daniel's interpretation of this dream makes it clear that the image revealed the course of Gentile kingdoms that were going to rule over Palestine and the people of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, the head of the Babylonian Empire, was represented by the head of gold. This even goes back to Jeremiah 51:7, when Jeremiah says, "Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand." So we see here Babylon represented as gold, and Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon ruled basically the known world for 66 years. And so, and they ruled a vast territory, as you can see. But then what happens is it gets really interesting. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. So the second part of the statue, the chest and the arms of silver, that represented the Medes and the Persians. We know that in about 539 BC, Darius the Mede, or Darius, however you want to pronounce it, the Mede conquered Babylon, and even though the kingdom lasted over 200 years longer than the Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar, apparently the Persian Empire was inferior. Silver is inferior to gold in terms of its relative value, but clearly stronger than gold in the sense that it conquered Babylon. Next to the belly and the thigh of bronze are the next elements. So that's the third kingdom to rise, and this was the Grecian Empire. Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire between 334 and 330 BC. By his conquest, Alexander the Great extended the Greek Empire as far east as the northwestern part of India, a huge empire that was probably the largest empire in the ancient Near East ever. So this was just an incredibly large area, territory that Alexander the Great ruled over. Um, oh, I'm sorry. Here we are, Alexander the Great. You see how much bigger it is, how much further east it extends than the Persian Empire. So this brings us now to the Fourth Kingdom. What do we know about the Fourth Kingdom? It says the Fourth Kingdom. There shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. What do we know about the fourth kingdom? The fourth kingdom is as you probably know, it's the Roman Empire. Even though the Roman Empire was divided into two legs and ultimately was a mixture of iron and clay, it was one empire. This empire was characterized by its strength, just as iron is stronger than bronze and silver and gold. The Roman Empire was stronger than any of these previous empires. It crushed all the empires that came before it, swallowed up the land and the people that had been parts of the three previous empires, and assimilated those lands into itself. So here's what we see of the Roman Empire. Just a vast territory. And then Daniel goes on and says, "And you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle." So this map, this kingdom refers to a divided Roman Empire, um, iron and clay, um, and we see that ultimately, and we'll learn later in Daniel 11, we'll see about more about this divided empire. Oops, sorry. The feet and the toes are the last form of the Roman Empire in the days and in the days of the second coming of the Messiah. The feet represent the same as the two legs, the eastern and western divisions of the Roman Empire. It's what we know as the sixth kingdom in the book of Revelations. The last form of this empire was partly strong and partly broken. That is partly weak. The weakness symbolized in the clay, the iron symbolized in the strength that breaks all the other materials to pieces. It's interesting that one of the strengths of Rome, its ability to assimilate other people and cultures into its culture, was one of its greatest weaknesses because the empire ultimately included so many different people that it essentially became ungovernable. Again, we'll see more of that later in later lessons. We go on, and in verse 26, in verse 43, Daniel says, "And you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven, will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure." So Daniel, it's kind of interesting way to end this section. Daniel makes a fascinating, supremely confident in the message that God has given him. The dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. And King, you can depend on this as certain as I'm standing here. It's interesting that more attention was directed to the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire, than to any of the other three put together. The fourth kingdom is the kingdom ultimately, or The divided kingdom is ultimately the kingdom in the latter days. Remember that Daniel had told Nebuchadnezzar that that was the reason for the image. God's speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, an idol worshiper. He's speaking to him through this image, and he's telling Nebuchadnezzar what the latter days will look like. The destruction of the image represents the coming of Jesus Christ. The stone, the one who's going to judge his enemies and establish his universal and eternal kingdom. It's a little bit of study on this. It's interesting. The imagery of the stone is used throughout scriptures, familiar image. Most notably, Jesus is called the stone that the builders rejected, and the cornerstone, or the chief cornerstone, in Psalm 118, Isaiah 28, all the synoptic gospels, and several of the Pauline epistles refer to Jesus as the stone that the builders rejected and the chief cornerstone. In other places, he called a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Romans, to mention a few. So Jesus is the stone that's going to put an end to the world governments. And that should be another comfort for all of us in this day and time, to know that all of the uncertainty and challenges that we face from our own governments are very limited in nature. We need to we certainly have to live in the present, but we need to have an eye toward the long term. We're in this for the long haul, as it were. And we see now Nebuchadnezzar's reaction. And Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is a God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Notice that he doesn't say your God is the God. He is a God of many gods. He is the Lord of many kings. He is not, Nebuchadnezzar has not come to the point where he sees Jehovah God as the God. He goes on in verse 48, says, "Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court." This idea of Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and paid homage to Daniel is interesting. And this translation would suggest, and others say it outright, that Nebuchadnezzar prostrated himself before Daniel. Implies that he worshipped Daniel. But Jewish interpreters and some of the older Jewish writings, non-extra biblical writings, assume that Daniel declined this reverence. We don't know that, but that's their assumption. But some early rabbis were quite critical of Daniel because they felt like he enjoyed too cozy of a relationship with this tyrant that destroyed the temple. Nevertheless, what we do know is the king was so moved by Daniel's interpretation that he fell down on his face before him and ordered that an offering be made to Daniel. An honor, that's not an honor that everybody gets. That's an honor that would have normally been reserved only for the gods of Babylon. So that kind of tells you where the king's head was at in all of this. Through Daniel's revelation and interpretation of the dream, Nebuchadnezzar confessed that Daniel's God is superior to all the gods of Babylon, and he's Lord over the kings of the earth. The great thing here is Daniel's God was exalted in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar because through Daniel, he revealed the course of coming events. It's interesting, these weren't necessarily, this wasn't necessarily a good end for the Babylonian Empire coming in 66 years, but nevertheless, Nebuchadnezzar was so awed by this dream that he couldn't help but worship Daniel and acknowledge God as the God of gods. He's acknowledged him as the revealer of mysteries, as Daniel said. And then Nebuchadnezzar appointed Daniel to a really significant position of responsibility, more significant than he had previously in government, and rewarded him with lots of lovely parting gifts. And it's interesting for Daniel and all of this. The kings that had to be heady stuff to have the king fall at his feet and to say these kinds of things, throw these gifts at him. But Daniel didn't forget his friends, and so he asked that they be promoted too. So the king made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators to serve under Daniel in the Babylonian province. So in a really remarkable way, God elevated Daniel to a position in the royal court so he could serve. I have to wonder if Daniel's there to serve as a mediator between the king and the exiles from Judah that were going to be coming soon. There were, as you know, three exiles, another to come in 597 and one in 586. So there's a sense in which Daniel maybe he's promoted to this place to help the Israelites as they transition to life in Babylon. But despite the destruction of the kingdoms predicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the dream had a message of hope for the Israelites, and that's the thing that we always want to point to at the end of this dream, no matter the fact that it took hundreds of years, or will takes over 2,500 years ultimately to realize this dream of Jesus' second coming and reigning on the earth. It's a message of hope for us, because it's as Daniel said, this dream is what did he say? The dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. We can trust in the promise of this dream that Daniel has interpreted. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts about this, and I wish I could take credit for this. I read this in a commentary by Warren Wiersbe that I thought was really meaningful. 4 things that Warren Wiersbe says we ought to take away from these events and be comforted by, even 2,500 years later. So these are things. This isn't just about Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. This is about you and I. We find out in this that this dream reveals that God is in control of history. He has been from the day that he created the world. He knows the future because he plans the future. And he uses even wicked rulers to carry out his plans. So we can rest comforted. Elections coming up, and everybody's in an uproar about that. And I am certainly a strong proponent of getting out and exercising your right to vote. But we can rest in the fact that God can use any of these rulers to carry out his plans for the future. This dream, it also reveals that human enterprises are only temporary, and that they're going to decline as time goes on. Even nations that appear to be durable for a seeming eternity are in danger of being crushed and toppled. What we're experiencing today in our world isn't unique in the history of the world. It's been going on since time began almost. The dream reveals that it'll be more and more difficult to hold things together as we approach the end of the age. Jesus promised us that. It's just going to get harder to be a Christian in this world. The iron in the images gives the appearance of strength and durability, but the clay was just the opposite. Interesting, treaties and promises and traditions and organizations are going to ultimately fail. And you know what? On our best day, we are only clay made out of the dust of the earth. So we should hold these things pretty loosely, I think. And finally, I think this dream reveals and assures us, as we've said, that Jesus will return. He's going to be the ultimate victor. He's going to destroy his enemies and establish his kingdom here on earth. The world is going to be delivered from evil, not by man-made promises and efforts, but by the promised return of Jesus Christ. So our hope doesn't need to be in the laws and political alliances or moral crusades. Our hope needs to be in the promises of God and in the only King that will last forever. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna ask Tim to open it up